The year is 1066. A cold October wind sweeps across the fields of southern England. On a ridge near Hastings, two armies stand face to face, each fighting not just for a crown, but for the fate of a nation. Shields gleam, banners ripple, and the sound of horns cuts through the morning mist. By sunset, the Anglo-Saxon world will crumble, a new power will rise, and England itself will never be the same again. It's one of those dates everyone remembers from school, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. But behind that simple line in the textbook lies a story far more complex, brutal, and fascinating than most people realize. This was not just a clash between Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy. It was the moment an entire culture was uprooted, reshaped, and reborn. When we talk about 1066, we often picture a single arrow, a fallen king, and a triumphant conqueror. But history is never that simple. The Norman Conquest was more than a military victory. It was a chain reaction that changed the language people spoke, the laws they lived under, the food they ate, and even the way they saw themselves as English. The echoes of that year still resonate through modern Britain, hidden in plain sight, in the words of everyday speech, in the traditions of the monarchy, and in the very landscape of the country. It was a story of ambition, betrayal, and survival, told not just through kings and knights, but through the ordinary people who lived in the shadow of conquest. Yet, what makes 1066 truly remarkable is not just what happened on the battlefield, but how it has lived in memory. Why does this one date, above all others, remain etched into our minds? Why has it become a symbol, a shorthand for everything that followed? And what are we missing when we accept the simplified version? The arrow, the charge, the victory. The truth is that the Norman Conquest was not the clean, heroic story it's often made out to be. It was messy, uncertain, and human. It was full of deception, propaganda, and struggle that lasted years after the battle ended. And in understanding it fully, we begin to see not just the story of medieval England, but the deeper pattern of how power, identity, and memory are shaped across time. So, as we look back nearly 1,000 years, we're not just exploring a distant past. We're uncovering the roots of the modern world. The way we speak, the way we govern, the way we think about who we are. 1066 is more than history. It's a mirror reflecting how nations are born, how myths are made, and how the past still defines us today. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we're diving deep into one of the most famous years in all of history, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. We'll explore what really happened on that bloody ridge, how the Norman Conquest transformed England forever, and why this date still echoes through language, law, and culture today. Get ready to see the story you thought you knew from a completely new perspective. The date 1066 has become one of the most easily recognized moments in English history. Even people who struggle to recall any other historical year can usually tell you that 1066 was the year of the Battle of Hastings. The event sits deep in British cultural memory. It is written into school lessons, old textbooks, quiz questions, and even jokes on social media. The number itself has become a symbol, not just of a battle, but of a whole idea about the making of England. Yet when people repeat the date, few think carefully about what actually happened, what it meant at the time, or why it still has such a strong hold on our imagination centuries later. The story that most of us learn about 1066 is short, dramatic, and clear. But that same simplicity hides a world of complexity. Behind the meme of 1066 lies a far more tangled story about politics, identity, and memory. The reason the year has stuck so firmly in the mind is that it marks a clear break in the English story. Historians once treated the Norman Conquest as the moment when medieval England was born. The tale is easy to remember. A strong-willed duke from across the Channel, William of Normandy, claimed the English throne after the death of King Edward the Confessor. Harold Godwinson, a powerful English noble, seized the crown instead. William built an army, crossed the sea, and met Harold's forces near Hastings. The two sides fought in October, and after a long day of battle, Harold was killed. William won, and England fell under Norman control. In the school version, that is more or less the whole story. It fits neatly into a single sentence, and ends with the idea that the Normans changed England forever. This version is told so often because it is easy to follow. It has clear characters, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It also has a sense of fate. William, seen as disciplined and clever, defeats Harold, who is brave but unlucky. The story can be told to children, illustrated with the Bayeux tapestry, and remembered without confusion. Teachers, writers, and even comedians use 1066 as a shorthand for a dramatic turning point. It feels safe and complete. But real history is never that neat, and the truth of 1066 is far more complicated. To understand why the year became so iconic, we should look at how people have used it over time. In the centuries that followed the conquest, both the English and the Normans told stories that served their own purposes. Norman writers praised William as a man chosen by God to bring order to a land that had fallen into chaos. English writers, on the other hand, described a loss of freedom and the suffering of their people under foreign rule. Over time, these competing views blended into a shared national story that could be shaped to fit whatever the moment required. For the Victorians, 1066 represented the triumph of discipline and progress over disorder. For later generations, it became a symbol of national endurance. Even today, it appears in films, television, and social media as a marker of Englishness. The number itself carries emotional weight. It stands for the idea that something massive and world-changing happened. Even if most people, the meme of 1066 works because it fits modern habits of thought. We like simple turning points, dates that divide the world into before and after. In a culture where information moves fast, it helps to have a historical anchor that everyone recognizes. 1066 serves that role perfectly. It compresses a messy series of events into one clean moment of change. It also flatters the idea that English history has a clear and continuous line from then until now. By repeating the date, we feel connected to a long past. It reassures us that history can be made sense of and that our culture rests on firm ground. Yet this confidence hides what was actually at stake in 1066. The battle was not just a fight for a crown between two ambitious men. It was part of a much larger struggle involving shifting loyalties, old traditions, and international politics. England in the 11th century was not an isolated island, but a crossroads of cultures. Scandinavian influence remained strong in the north and east. French-speaking Norman lords had long been part of the political network of northern Europe. The church connected England to Rome. The death of Edward the Confessor without a clear heir set off a chain of claims and counterclaims that drew on this wide web of relations. William's invasion was not a sudden, isolated act of conquest, but the result of years of diplomatic maneuvering and personal ambition. Even the famous battle itself was not as straightforward as legend suggests. We're used to thinking of it as a clash between two armies on a single day. The images of Harold with an arrow in his eye, or William riding triumphantly across the field, are now part of English folklore. But in reality, the fighting was fierce, confusing, and uncertain. Sources disagree on where exactly Harold was killed, how the Norman cavalry behaved, and how close the outcome was. Some accounts suggest the English line held firm for most of the day, and that William's victory was far from guaranteed. There is also evidence that Harold had just fought another battle in the north against a Norwegian army before marching south to meet William. His men were exhausted, and their losses weakened them. None of these details fit neatly into the simple story that most people know, but they change how we understand the event. The aftermath of Hastings was also far more gradual and contested than the quick version allows. William did not instantly control England. Many areas resisted for years. Rebellions broke out across the country, and Norman rule had to be established town by town. William's forces built castles to secure their power and replaced English nobles with Norman lords. The famous Domesday Book, completed 2 decades later, was part of this process of consolidation. It listed lands, resources, and ownership to help the new rulers manage their kingdom. The conquest was not a single event, but an extended transformation that reshaped every part of English society. Another part of the missing context is how the conquest changed language, law, and culture. The Normans brought their own French dialect, which blended with Old English to create the early form of English we use today. Many legal and administrative terms in modern English still come from Norman French. The ruling class became bilingual, and for a long time, official documents were written in Latin or French. This linguistic shift shows that the conquest was not simply a military victory, but a deep cultural merger. Yet the standard story rarely touches on these subtleties because they do not fit the heroic image of a single decisive battle. The meme of 1066 also hides the human cost. Behind the romantic images of knights and banners were real people caught up in violence. The invasion caused widespread suffering. Villages were destroyed, families displaced, and entire regions laid waste during William's campaigns to suppress resistance. The north of England was especially hard hit during the campaign, known as the Harrying of the North, which left large areas barren for years. But this brutal reality does not make for an uplifting national story, so it often disappears behind the tidy date. Remembering 1066 only as a proud turning point risks erasing the pain and complexity of what followed. The simple story also narrows our sense of who the English were. Before the conquest, England was not a unified or stable nation in the modern sense. It was a patchwork of regions with different loyalties and traditions. The kings of England had long struggled to assert authority over powerful local lords. The idea of a single English identity was still taking shape. After the conquest, the blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon elites created new forms of governance and culture. Many of the institutions we think of as typically English, such as the common law and the centralized monarchy, developed through this fusion. So while the meme of 1066 marks a break, the reality was a process of continuity and change. The line between conqueror and conquered blurred over time. Part of why 1066 remains so entrenched is that it satisfies emotional and political needs. For nationalists, it can be used to celebrate the endurance of England through conquest. For others, it serves as a warning about foreign domination. For educators, it provides an easy entry point into medieval history. And for the internet age, it works as a kind of shorthand, a historical punchline that everyone gets. The simplicity makes it adaptable. But each time it is used in this way, the deeper context fades a little more from view. The battle becomes a symbol rather than an event. When we look more closely, we see that the conquest was not even the only major invasion that year. Before William landed, Harold had already faced another threat from the north. King Harold Hardrada of Norway invaded with a large army, and Harold Godwinson defeated him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. That victory came only a few weeks before Hastings, leaving Harold's men exhausted. This sequence of battles reveals how unstable England's position was. It also shows how interconnected the northern world had become. The Norwegians, Normans, and English all drew on overlapping claims to kinship and inheritance. The struggle for the English throne was part of a wider European story, not a local one. If we view 1066 in this wider frame, it looks less like a single turning point and more like a chapter in a long process of transformation. The roots of the conquest lay in earlier centuries of Viking raids, continental alliances, and church reforms. Its consequences lasted for generations, influencing everything from architecture to law. The castles that sprang up across the country reshaped the landscape. The new aristocracy built cathedrals that still define English towns. The feudal system introduced by the Normans altered land ownership and social hierarchy. Over time, the descendants of Norman and English families merged, forming a new elite that spoke a language that was neither purely French nor purely English. By the time of later kings, the differences between conqueror and conquered had blurred into something entirely new. Understanding these layers does not make 1066 less important. In fact, it makes it more meaningful. It reminds us that history is rarely about single moments of destiny, but about the interaction of countless forces. The battle at Hastings mattered, but not in the simple way we often think. It was one expression of a long struggle for power in a world of shifting identities. The fact that we remember it as a clean break says more about modern desires for clarity than about the reality of the 11th century. The continued hold of 1066 on our imagination also reflects how we use history to tell stories about ourselves. Nations often build identity around a few clear symbols. For the United States, it might be 1776. For France, 1789. For England, 1066. These dates become touchstones that seem to define who we are. But like all symbols, they simplify. They strip away uncertainty and present history as a story of heroes, victories, and beginnings. The problem is not that these stories are false, but that they leave out too much. When we turn 1066 into a meme, we lose sight of the messy human world behind it. That world was full of contradictions. William's rule combined harsh control with pragmatic compromise. He rewarded his followers with English lands, but also adopted parts of the Old English system to make his rule work. He relied on English administrators and respected some local customs. The church gained power, yet it also became more closely tied to Rome, changing its relationship with the crown. Peasants saw little immediate improvement in their lives. The Norman aristocracy lived in castles while ordinary people struggled to survive. Women's roles shifted as well, as property and inheritance laws changed under Norman influence. All of these threads are part of the story of the conquest, but they rarely appear in the brief version we recite. Even the way the battle has been remembered over time reveals how memory works. The Bayeux Tapestry, for example, is one of our main sources, but it was designed as propaganda. It presents William's claim as legitimate and Harold's actions as deceitful. The tapestry's images shape how later generations imagine the event. But if we rely on it without question, we see only the Norman side. English sources, written later and often with less detail, tell a different story. They speak of loss and betrayal rather than triumph. Both perspectives are biased, and the truth lies somewhere between them. When we remember 1066 only through the tapestry or the schoolbook summary, we inherit those biases without noticing. Another overlooked element is how the conquest connected England more closely with continental Europe. Under Norman rule, England became part of a network that stretched from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. Trade expanded, and ideas flowed more freely. The architecture of English cathedrals began to reflect continental styles. The legal system absorbed influences from both Roman and Frankish traditions. The conquest, in other words, tied England into a broader European story rather than separating it. That is an important point to remember in modern debates about identity and isolation. 1066 reminds us that England's roots are deeply entangled with the rest of Europe. If we strip away the myth and look honestly at the event, what remains is both less certain and more interesting. 1066 was not destiny but circumstance. It was shaped by chance, timing, and human decision. Had Harold delayed his march south, or had William's fleet been scattered by storms, the outcome might have been different. The line between victory and defeat was thin. Yet the consequences of that narrow margin reshaped centuries of history. This fragile chain of events is far more revealing than the tidy myth we repeat. So when people share jokes about 1066 online or answer quiz questions about it, they are participating in a kind of collective memory. The meme works because it condenses a vast and confusing past into something instantly recognizable. But that same convenience is what makes it misleading. The real story of the conquest challenges our habit of seeing history as a series of clean breaks and clear lessons. It forces us to face how power, culture, and identity evolve through conflict and compromise. The year 1066 should not be treated as a slogan, but as an invitation to look closer. When we do, we see that the so-called beginning of English history in 1066 was actually a continuation of older patterns of invasion, adaptation, and blending. The English identity that later generations celebrated was born not from a single victory or defeat, but from centuries of interaction between peoples. The Norman Conquest was just one episode in that longer story. Its legacy can be traced in the English language, in the shapes of towns, in the persistence of monarchy, and in the national character that prides itself on resilience and adaptation. Remembering 1066 as a meme misses all of that richness. The challenge, then, is not to stop mentioning the date, but to give it back its depth. Instead of seeing it as a symbol of simple conquest, we can view it as a mirror reflecting the complexity of history itself. Behind the familiar number lie countless human stories: ambition, fear, courage, loss, and survival. The power of 1066 does not come from its neatness, but from its ability to remind us how layered and unpredictable the past really was. When we understand that, the date becomes more than a meme. It becomes a lesson in humility about how little of history fits into a single sentence. Before the armies met on the slopes near Hastings, the path to that battlefield had already been shaped by years of tension, shifting loyalties, and an extraordinary series of decisions made under pressure. The months before the battle were filled with uncertainty, rumor, and diplomacy as much as they were with marching soldiers. The story of 1066 cannot be understood without looking at what happened before the armies clashed. The chaos that preceded Hastings reveals the limits of power in medieval Europe, the fragile nature of loyalty, and the sharp intelligence of the leaders who fought not only with swords but with strategy and persuasion. Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy were not simply warriors. They were political players navigating a world of competing interests. Their contest was as much a test of minds as of armies. When Edward the Confessor died early in the year, he left behind a crisis with no clear solution. The king had no children, and the question of who should succeed him had been the source of quiet tension for years. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, was at the center of that uncertainty. As Earl of Wessex, he had wealth, military strength, and political influence unmatched by any rival. His family had dominated English politics for decades. Yet his claim to the throne was not straightforward. Although the English nobles and clergy accepted him as king, other men across the sea believed Edward had promised the crown to them. One of those men was William, Duke of Normandy, who insisted that Edward had named him heir years earlier and that Harold himself had sworn to support that claim. Whether that oath was freely given or made under duress remains unclear, but it became the foundation of William's argument for invasion. For Harold, the early months of his reign were a constant balancing act. He had to secure his rule at home while preparing for threats from abroad. The English court was divided between those loyal to his family and others who resented their dominance. In the north, powerful earls such as Edwin and Morcar watched closely to see whether Harold would share power or seek to control them. Across the sea, William was already preparing his case before the courts of Europe. And in the far north, another storm was gathering. King Harold Hardrada of Norway, a seasoned warrior with a long record of conquest, also believed he had a right to the English crown. He based his claim on an earlier agreement between the Norwegian and English kings that whoever outlived the other would inherit both realms. That agreement had never been ratified by the English nobles, but Hardrada saw an opportunity to press it now that Edward was gone. Harold faced the impossible task of defending his new throne from two of the most experienced military leaders in Europe at once. He could not be everywhere. He also had to maintain the loyalty of his nobles and keep the population united. In the summer, news reached England that William was building ships and gathering men on the Norman coast. Harold mobilized his forces and stationed them along the southern shores to guard against invasion. But as weeks passed with no sign of Norman sails, supplies began to run short. Armies in this period could not stay in the field indefinitely. The men needed food, and harvest season was approaching. Harold was forced to disband part of his army so that farmers could return home. It was at this moment of vulnerability that the northern threat struck. In late summer, Hardrada sailed from Norway with a fleet carrying thousands of warriors. He was joined by Harold's own brother, Tostig, who had been exiled years earlier after rebelling against him. This family betrayal added a painful twist to the crisis. Tostig's resentment had festered since his removal as Earl of Northumbria, and he saw Hardrada's invasion as a chance to regain his lost power. The Norwegian army landed in the north and quickly captured several towns. Harold, still watching the southern coast, now had to react with speed. He gathered his forces and marched his army north with remarkable urgency, covering hundreds of miles in only a few days. His arrival caught the Norwegians by surprise. At Stamford Bridge, Harold won a fierce battle, killing both Hardrada and Tostig. The victory was total but costly. Many of his best soldiers were dead or wounded, and those who survived were exhausted from the long march. While Harold was fighting in the north, William finally launched his invasion. The winds that had kept his fleet in port for weeks suddenly turned in his favor. He landed on the southern coast near Pevensey and began constructing defensive works, securing a foothold in enemy territory. The timing could not have been worse for Harold. He had barely finished celebrating his victory when word arrived that the Normans had landed. He now faced the agonizing choice of whether to rest and regroup or to march his army south immediately. Every day he waited gave William more time to fortify his position and gather support. Every day he moved risked breaking his own strength. In the end, Harold chose speed. It was a decision driven by urgency, pride, and perhaps fear of losing control. He raced south again, forcing his men through another grueling march. While Harold struggled to hold his kingdom together, William was waging a different kind of war. Before he even set foot on English soil, he had already begun shaping the story that would justify his conquest. He knew that invading another Christian kingdom without cause could bring condemnation from the church and from rival rulers. To protect himself, William launched a campaign of persuasion that stretched across Europe. He sent envoys to Rome, presenting his claim to the English throne as a righteous cause. His supporters argued that Harold had broken a sacred oath by taking the crown that rightly belonged to William. The Pope, persuaded by this argument, granted William a special banner as a sign of divine approval. This was not a small gesture. It turned his invasion into a holy mission. By portraying himself as the defender of justice and faith, William secured moral legitimacy. His army was not just a band of mercenaries, but a force blessed by God. William's psychological warfare went beyond Rome. Across Normandy and neighboring regions, he used propaganda to rally support. He promised land and titles to those who joined him and spread stories of Harold's treachery. He crafted an image of himself as a rightful heir denied his due. This narrative helped attract soldiers from across Europe, turning his expedition into a multinational effort. Many of these men were not Norman by birth, but adventurers seeking reward. They came from Flanders, Brittany, and even parts of Italy. William turned his cause into a shared enterprise, using belief, greed, and ambition as tools. By the time his fleet set sail, he had already won half the battle in hearts and minds. The way William organized his campaign also showed his understanding of human psychology. He knew that fear and uncertainty could weaken his enemies. Once landed in England, he moved quickly to burn and pillage the surrounding countryside, not simply for supplies but to send a message. He wanted to draw Harold into battle before the English king could rest or gather reinforcements. The devastation around Hastings was designed to provoke, forcing Harold to respond out of anger rather than strategy. In this, William proved masterful. Harold, driven by a sense of duty and pride, took the bait. His decision to engage so soon after his northern campaign played directly into William's hands. Meanwhile, alliances and betrayals rippled through the region. The Norman court had spent years cultivating friendships and marriage ties across Europe. William's wife, Matilda of Flanders, came from one of the most powerful families in the region, and through her connections, he secured additional troops and ships. Even within England, loyalties were divided. Some of the northern earls had only grudgingly accepted Harold's rule. They delayed sending help, whether out of fear or quiet sympathy for the Normans. The absence of their forces at Hastings may have changed the outcome. In the world of medieval politics, loyalty was never absolute. It shifted with opportunity and self-interest. William understood this better than anyone. He knew that power rested as much on perception as on strength. Harold's situation grew more desperate as he marched south. His exhausted soldiers faced an enemy that was well-fed, well-rested, and strategically positioned. Yet his sense of duty, and perhaps his belief in divine justice, pushed him forward. He may have believed that speed and surprise could still give him the edge. But William had planned for every scenario. His scouts tracked Harold's movement, and his army prepared the ground for battle. The night before the clash, both sides must have felt the weight of what was coming. For Harold, the stakes were nothing less than the survival of his kingdom. For William, it was the chance to prove his divine right and secure eternal fame. Looking back, it is tempting to see Harold's choices as reckless, but they were also human. He was caught between two crises, both demanding immediate attention. To ignore the Norwegian invasion would have meant losing the north. To wait too long after William's landing would have meant losing the south. Every move was a gamble. In that sense, Harold's campaign before Hastings was not a failure of strategy, but a reflection of impossible circumstances. His strength lay in his courage and speed. His weakness lay in the limits of what one man could control. William's success, by contrast, lay in patience and calculation. He waited for the right wind, gathered support from across Europe, and shaped the moral narrative before the first sword was drawn. He used every tool available, faith, fear, promises, and propaganda, to build an image of inevitability. When his ships crossed the Channel, he was not merely invading. He was performing a drama that he had already written in advance. Each act, from his appeal to the Pope to the burning of English villages, was part of a carefully designed strategy. He made sure that even if he failed, his claim would be remembered as just. That psychological preparation gave his men confidence and unity. They believed they were fighting for a rightful cause, not just for plunder. The political chess leading up to Hastings was therefore not just about armies moving on maps. It was about perception, timing, and belief. Harold's decisions were shaped by duty and immediacy, William's by patience and manipulation. Both men operated in a world where communication was slow and information was often uncertain. Rumors could change the course of action overnight. The sudden shifts in weather, loyalty, and morale made every move dangerous. Yet through it all, both leaders showed remarkable skill. Harold's rapid response to Hardrada's invasion remains one of the most impressive military feats of the age. William's ability to turn an illegal invasion into a holy mission was a masterstroke of politics. When the two armies finally faced each other near Hastings, they carried with them the weight of all this chaos. The battle was not simply a military encounter, but the culmination of months of maneuvering, persuasion, and betrayal. The fields of Sussex became the stage where the outcome of years of rivalry would be decided in a single day. Behind every sword stroke lay months of planning and desperation. The soldiers on both sides were not just fighting for their leaders, but for the tangled web of promises and fears that had brought them there. If we trace the events leading up to that day, we see that the conquest was never inevitable. It was the result of timing, weather, human pride, and luck. Harold's victories in the north might have secured his throne had the winds held William's ships a little longer. William's invasion might have failed had his propaganda not convinced the Pope to bless his cause. Each decision built upon another, creating a chain so delicate that the breaking of any single link could have changed history. That is the deeper truth behind the famous battle. The conquest began long before the first arrow flew, in the minds and hearts of the men who played this dangerous game of power. The chaos before Hastings reminds us that history often turns on unseen choices. It shows how fear, ambition, and belief can shape events as much as armies and weapons. Harold's struggle to defend his crown against two foreign powers reveals the crushing weight of leadership in a world without certainty. William's calculated manipulation of faith and reputation shows how politics can be as deadly as war. Together, their stories form a study in contrasts, one man driven by immediate danger, the other by long-term design. The simplicity of the later legend hides the tangled web that connected every action. The invasion of England was not born in a moment, but in years of shifting alliances and restless ambition. The missing context of 1066 is that the battle was only the visible surface of a much deeper conflict. The decisions made in royal halls, the letters sent to Rome, the betrayals whispered between nobles, all of these shaped the outcome as much as swords and shields did. The legend that endures makes it seem as though fate had already chosen William's victory. But the truth is that both men fought against forces beyond their control, and the line between triumph and ruin was vanishingly thin. The field at Hastings was the end of a long, desperate struggle that began the moment Edward the Confessor died. What followed, the Norman rule, the transformation of England's language and law, was only possible because of the chaos, cunning, and courage that came before. The true story of 1066, when told in full, is not just about who won the battle, but about how every choice in the months before it made that outcome possible. The morning of the battle arrived heavy with tension, the air thick with fog and fear. Both armies had spent the night in uneasy preparation, and as dawn broke over the slopes near Hastings, what had begun as a contest of ambition now stood on the edge of legend. The date would live forever, yet what unfolded that day was far from the neat, heroic story so often retold. Behind the banners and the recorded names lay exhaustion, confusion, and the raw brutality of medieval combat. The field known later as Senlac Hill became the site of one of the most famous and misunderstood battles in history, where courage and chaos were indistinguishable and where myth slowly replaced memory. When Harold Godwinson reached the ridge overlooking the Norman positions, his men were weary from their forced march. They had little time to rest or organize before facing the invaders. Despite this, Harold took advantage of the terrain. The ridge provided a strong defensive position, steep enough to make cavalry charges difficult. He formed his men into a shield wall, a formation honed by generations of English warriors. Shoulder to shoulder, with shields overlapping, they presented an almost solid wall of wood and iron. Behind that barrier stood both professional housecarls and hastily gathered militia. They carried long axes, spears, and swords, the weapons of farmers and nobles alike. The strength of this formation lay in its discipline. As long as it held, the Normans would find it nearly impossible to break through. William of Normandy's army was different in both composition and tactics. He brought with him a mix of infantry, archers, and cavalry drawn from across northern Europe. The use of mounted knights gave him a tactical edge unfamiliar to many English troops. His plan was to use his archers to weaken the shield wall before sending infantry forward to engage, followed by a cavalry charge to exploit any gaps. But this plan depended on breaking the English line's discipline, something far easier in theory than in practice. Harold's men, hardened by years of defending against Viking raids, were not easily intimidated. The first volleys of Norman arrows did little to shake them. The early phase of the battle was brutal and uncertain. The Normans advanced uphill, their arrows flying high, many glancing off shields or missing entirely. The English line stood firm, absorbing the shock of the infantry assault and repelling it with heavy blows from axes. The clash of iron and the roar of voices filled the morning. William's cavalry then surged forward, seeking to break the shield wall through sheer force. But the slope worked against them. Horses slipped on the uneven ground, and riders found themselves exposed to deadly counterstrikes. Again and again, the Norman attacks were thrown back. At one point, rumors spread through the Norman ranks that William had been killed. Panic rippled through his army, and parts of it began to fall back. In that moment of confusion, the outcome could have turned against him completely. William's response was swift and decisive. Lifting his helmet to reveal his face, he rode through his men shouting that he still lived. This act of leadership steadied the army and restored its morale. It also revealed one of William's key strengths: his ability to manage not just strategy but emotion. He understood that victory in such battles depended as much on the spirit of the troops as on their weapons. With the line restored, he ordered a renewed assault. This time, he employed a tactic that later chroniclers would describe as the feigned retreat. Whether this was planned or improvised remains debated. The Normans appeared to retreat down the hill, drawing some English soldiers into pursuit. When the English line broke formation to chase them, the Normans turned and counterattacked, cutting down those who had left the safety of the shield wall. It was a turning point, though not the clean maneuver later romanticized in retellings. The so-called feigned retreat may not have been a deliberate strategy at all. Some historians believe that the early withdrawals were genuine confusion among the Norman ranks rather than calculated deception. Medieval battles were rarely coordinated with precision. Communication was limited to shouting and the waving of banners. In the noise and dust, even simple orders could be misunderstood. What may have looked like a tactical ploy to later observers might have been the chaotic ebb and flow of men reacting to fear and opportunity. Either way, the effect was real. The English formation began to lose its unity. Once gaps appeared in the shield wall, the Normans pressed in with renewed vigor. As the day wore on, fatigue became a deadly enemy for both sides. Hours of continuous fighting under the autumn sun drained strength and morale. The ground grew slippery with mud and blood. The cries of the wounded and the clash of weapons mixed into a single, relentless sound. There were no organized pauses, no time for reflection, only survival. The English shield wall, though formidable, could not hold forever. Every time a man fell, the gap had to be filled instantly. Once gaps remained open too long, Norman swords and spears found their way through. Amid this chaos, the most enduring image of the battle took shape: the death of Harold. The traditional version tells that he was struck in the eye by an arrow and died instantly, bringing about the collapse of English resistance. This image, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, has dominated popular understanding of the battle for centuries. Yet the truth is far less certain. The tapestry itself, though vivid, is ambiguous. The figure often identified as Harold appears with an arrow near his face, but another figure nearby is being struck down by a sword. Some scholars suggest that the arrow detail was added during later repairs to the tapestry, possibly centuries after the battle. Others argue that Harold was indeed struck by an arrow, but did not die from it immediately, instead falling later during hand-to-hand combat. Alternative accounts from the period describe Harold's death differently. The chronicler William of Poitiers, who wrote close to the events, claimed that the king was cut down by a group of Norman knights, perhaps including William himself. Another source, written decades later, tells of Harold being dismembered, his body so mutilated that his mistress was called upon to identify it. These variations suggest that the exact manner of Harold's death was uncertain even to those who lived close to the time. The arrow story may have persisted because it provided a simple, almost poetic image of divine punishment, echoing the idea that Harold's supposed oath-breaking had brought about his downfall. It turned a messy, human death into a symbol. The fixation on that single arrow obscures the reality of the battle's final moments. Harold's fall, however it occurred, marked the breaking point of English resistance, but it was not the end of the fighting. His housecarls fought on fiercely around his body, unwilling to yield even as they were surrounded. The Norman cavalry closed in, hacking through the remnants of the shield wall. The melee that followed was savage and confused. Men fought in small clusters, slipping over corpses, blinded by blood and sweat. There were no clear lines anymore, only desperate struggles between individuals. The noise must have been deafening, the shouts of commands lost in the roar of combat, the screams of the dying mingling with the clash of weapons. The brutality of 11th-century warfare is often softened in popular memory, but the reality was horrifying. Weapons were designed to maim as much as to kill. Axes shattered limbs, swords opened skulls, and spears impaled men through shields. Armor offered some protection, but not certainty. Many soldiers would have died slowly from wounds or suffocation beneath fallen bodies. Horses, too, were cut down, adding to the chaos. In the tight press of men, there was little room to maneuver. Combatants could not always tell friend from foe in the dust and confusion. When the English line finally broke, pursuit and slaughter followed. Defeated soldiers were cut down as they fled through the woods and marshes around the battlefield. Few prisoners were taken, for in that world mercy was a luxury. William's army, though victorious, suffered heavily. Many of his knights and foot soldiers lay dead or dying on the slope. The battle had lasted from morning until near sunset, a grueling span that tested every man's endurance. Victory came not from flawless strategy, but from persistence and luck. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the field was a scene of devastation. Harold's body, once found, was reportedly mangled beyond recognition. William ordered it buried without honor, though later stories claim it was given to his family for a secret burial. Whether true or not, the treatment of Harold's remains became another part of the legend, a symbol of the ruthless finality of conquest. What made this day so decisive was not just the death of a king, but the destruction of the English leadership. Many of the kingdom's nobles fell alongside Harold, leaving no unified command to rally the survivors. William moved quickly to exploit this vacuum. Yet in the immediate aftermath, his victory was far from secure. The people of England did not instantly accept him as king. Resistance continued in various regions for years. But on that single day, the backbone of organized English defense was broken. The battle had not been a clean clash of good and evil, or even of two equal armies meeting with chivalric grace. It was a long, grinding ordeal in which both sides endured unspeakable suffering. The image of the arrow in the eye may endure because it gives closure, a single moment to mark the end. The truth, however, was slower, bloodier, and far more human. The tactics of both armies have been studied endlessly, yet much of what is said about them rests on fragments of evidence and later interpretation. Harold's choice to fight defensively was logical given his position, but it also left him reactive rather than proactive. His shield wall was formidable but inflexible. It depended entirely on discipline. Once that discipline cracked, the formation became a trap, preventing retreat or regrouping. William's mixed army gave him more options. His use of archers, infantry, and cavalry in combination reflected a new style of warfare emerging from continental Europe. Yet even his tactics were far from flawless. The early assaults uphill wasted lives, and only his personal intervention prevented disaster when panic spread. Both sides showed courage and ingenuity, but neither displayed perfect control. The battle's outcome turned on endurance as much as on strategy. To imagine the scene on Senlac Hill is to picture something far removed from the clean illustrations of history books. The ridge was not a wide open plain but uneven ground, churned to mud by hooves and boots. The air was filled with smoke from fires set by both sides. Communication depended on the sight of flags or the sound of horns, easily lost in the din. The chaos meant that many soldiers had no clear sense of what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Victory and defeat unfolded not in grand sweeping motions, but in countless small moments of struggle. Each man's world shrank to the few feet around him, to the enemy's face, to the next swing of his weapon. When people later spoke of destiny being decided on that hill, they forgot how random and desperate the reality felt to those who were there. After the battle ended, the ground was littered with the dead. The survivors looted what they could, stripping armor and weapons from the fallen. The stench of death lingered for days. There was no formal burial for most of the dead. Many were left where they fell. In the coming months, locals would find bones and broken weapons scattered across the fields. Even generations later, people still told stories of ghosts haunting the site. Such tales were not simply superstition. They were ways of coping with the trauma of such immense violence. The battle had not only decided a throne, but had torn through the lives of thousands of ordinary people who had little understanding of the politics that brought them there. The myth that grew around Hastings in later centuries served to give order to what had been chaos. Chroniclers preferred to write of noble charges, clever tactics, and divine justice rather than of exhaustion and fear. The arrow became a symbol, the retreat a deliberate plan, the conquest an act of destiny. In truth, the battle was a contest of endurance fought by men who could barely see beyond the immediate struggle to survive. Harold and William were both strong leaders, but neither could control the madness once battle began. Their fates, and the fate of England, were shaped as much by confusion as by design. Understanding the day of battle in its full context connects directly to everything that came before it. The political chaos, the psychological warfare, and the shifting alliances all converged on that hill. Every decision made in the months before found its consequence there. Harold's exhaustion from his northern campaign, William's use of propaganda, the uncertainty of loyalty among the English nobility, all these elements played their part. The battle was not simply the final act, but the inevitable collision of all that tension. To reduce it to an arrow or a single maneuver is to forget the human complexity behind it. What happened on that ridge in Sussex was not the clean triumph of one civilization over another, but the culmination of years of uncertainty, ambition, and fear. The Norman knights who cheered their victory did not yet know how difficult holding England would be. The English survivors who fled into the forests did not yet realize that their world had changed forever. The field at Hastings was both an ending and a beginning, a moment when the old order of Anglo-Saxon England collapsed and the foundations of Norman England began to form. But beneath the legend, beneath the arrow in the eye and the stories of cunning tactics, lies the real essence of that day. Exhaustion, courage, brutality, and the fragile line between order and chaos that defines all of human history. When the sun set on the battlefield at Hastings, the air was thick with smoke, blood, and silence. The clash that had begun as a contest for the English crown ended as a catastrophe for an entire people. Harold Godwinson lay dead among his men, his shield wall shattered, his banner trampled into the mud. William of Normandy, now victorious, faced a land that had lost its king but not its will. The conquest of England did not end with the battle. In truth, it had barely begun. What followed was years of devastation, rebellion, and transformation so deep that it reshaped the very soul of the country. The immediate aftermath of Hastings was defined by violence and fear, and its long-term effects reached into every corner of English life, its language, laws, identity, and place in the wider world. The days following the battle were grim beyond measure. William's army, though victorious, was exhausted and bloodied. The Norman dead littered the slope alongside English bodies. The surviving English who had not fled were hunted or captured. William understood that a swift show of control was essential. He could not allow the country to regroup or rally behind another leader. Yet his position was precarious. He held only a small part of southern England, and the rest of the kingdom was vast, divided, and hostile. The old English nobility, though weakened, still commanded respect and could easily inspire rebellion. William's first moves were cautious but ruthless. He advanced slowly toward London, burning villages and seizing supplies as he went, forcing submission through terror as much as persuasion. When he reached London, he found the city divided and frightened. The death of Harold had created a power vacuum. Some nobles wanted to resist, others to negotiate, and others still to secure their own positions. After brief hesitation, the leaders of the church and the surviving nobles offered William the crown, perhaps believing resistance was hopeless or hoping to preserve their privileges under the new regime. William was crowned on Christmas Day, in a ceremony meant to evoke legitimacy and divine favor. Yet the coronation itself nearly ended in disaster. A misunderstanding between the English inside the church and the Norman guards outside led to chaos and flames, as soldiers thought a riot had begun and set nearby houses on fire. Even in victory, mistrust and fear defined the relationship between conqueror and conquered. William's rule in the years immediately after Hastings was far from secure. Across the country, rebellion flared repeatedly. The North, fiercely independent and less touched by Norman control, became a center of resistance. Local leaders rose in defiance, calling on the memory of the fallen Harold and appealing to old loyalties. For several years, William had to march his armies across the kingdom, putting down uprisings with increasing brutality. The most infamous of these campaigns was the one known later as the Harrying of the North. In this operation, William ordered widespread destruction of farmland, villages, and livestock to break the spirit of rebellion. The result was famine and death on a massive scale. Entire regions were left barren, their populations either killed or forced to flee. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of corpses littering the roads and of people resorting to eating roots to survive. Modern historians estimate that large parts of northern England remained depopulated for a generation. It was an act of calculated terror, meant to crush opposition once and for all. This period of guerrilla warfare and devastation revealed how fragile William's victory really was. The Norman army was powerful but small, and it depended on constant reinforcement and supply from across the Channel. Every rebellion forced William to stretch his resources further. The English, meanwhile, fought in a different way than their conquerors expected. They avoided large battles, striking instead at garrisons and supply lines, melting into forests and marshes after each attack. These tactics frustrated the Normans, who were trained for open-field combat. It took years of siege, starvation, and relentless punishment to bring the resistance under control. Even then, occasional uprisings continued, especially in the north and west. The conquest, often portrayed as swift and decisive, was in reality a slow, grinding process of subjugation. While the fighting continued, the structure of English society was being dismantled piece by piece. William replaced the old Anglo-Saxon nobility with his Norman followers, granting them vast estates carved from confiscated English lands. This redistribution of property was the foundation of his power. The Domesday Survey, completed 2 decades later, recorded the outcome. Nearly all land in England had passed into Norman hands. The old aristocracy was almost entirely wiped out or reduced to servitude. This was not merely a change of rulers, but a complete reordering of social hierarchy. Castles began to appear across the landscape, symbols of domination and control. Built of timber at first and later of stone, these fortresses served both military and psychological purposes. They reminded the population of who now held power and provided refuge for Norman garrisons in hostile territory. The church, too, underwent transformation. William replaced many of the English bishops with Normans loyal to him, ensuring that religious authority aligned with his rule. The connection between church and crown became tighter, and English religious life became more continental in character. The architectural revolution that followed produced the great Romanesque cathedrals that still stand today, built by Norman craftsmen and funded by new lords eager to display their wealth and piety. These buildings were not just places of worship, but monuments to the new order. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was linguistic and cultural. Before the conquest, the English language was rooted in Germanic tradition, though already influenced by Latin and Norse. After the conquest, Norman French became the language of the court, the church, and the law. Latin remained the language of learning, while English survived only among the common people. For centuries, England became a trilingual society: French for the rulers, Latin for the clerics, and English for the rest. Gradually, these languages blended, shaping the future of English into what would later become Middle English. Words for law, government, and culture came from French, while the everyday vocabulary of the people remained Anglo-Saxon. This fusion created the basis of the language we use today, where simple words like house and bread coexist with mansion and feast. The conquest thus left a linguistic legacy that still defines English identity. Culturally, the Normans introduced new customs, tastes, and ideas about governance. They brought continental notions of feudalism, in which loyalty was tied to land ownership and hierarchical obligation. Every noble held his lands from the king in exchange for military service. This system centralized authority in ways the old Anglo-Saxon structure had not. It bound the nobility directly to the crown, reducing the power of independent regional lords. The king's word became law, and his control over land gave him unmatched leverage. Over time, this laid the groundwork for a more unified English monarchy, though in the short term it deepened resentment among the native population. The sense of displacement and injustice endured for generations, shaping how later English kings would face rebellion and reform. The conquest also changed the way England saw itself in relation to the rest of Europe. Under Norman rule, England was no longer an island kingdom looking inward. It became part of a wider network of continental politics. The King of England was also a powerful duke in France, owing theoretical allegiance to the French crown while holding greater resources than many continental rulers. This dual identity created opportunities and tensions that would shape centuries of conflict. The seeds of later wars with France were planted in the very structure of Norman power. England's fate was now bound to the complexities of European rivalry. For ordinary people, life after the conquest was marked by hardship and uncertainty. Taxes increased to fund castle construction and military campaigns. Many villages were destroyed or relocated to make room for Norman estates. The Old English laws were replaced or reinterpreted in ways that favored the new lords. Slavery, which had existed in Anglo-Saxon England, began to decline as the Normans preferred serfdom, binding peasants to the land rather than treating them as property. This shift, though brutal in its own way, eventually contributed to a more stable form of rural society. Yet for those who lived through the transition, it meant years of insecurity. The memory of freedom under native kings lingered in stories and songs, preserving a sense of loss that would echo through the generations. Resistance never fully disappeared. Legends grew around outlaws who fought against Norman oppression, figures who blended history and myth. These early tales of defiance against foreign rule would evolve over time into stories like that of Robin Hood, symbols of justice and the enduring spirit of the common people. Such legends reveal how deep the scars of conquest ran. Even as Norman rule became normalized, the English never forgot the violence that had brought it about. Over the centuries, the conquerors themselves became English, adopting the language and customs of the land they had seized. By blending with the people they once subjugated, they helped create a new, hybrid identity that was neither purely Norman nor purely Anglo-Saxon. This new identity carried both strength and tension. The monarchy that emerged from the conquest was stronger than any before it, but it also carried within it the contradictions of its origins. The king's power rested on conquest and control, yet he ruled a population that valued old notions of local rights and justice. Over time, these conflicting impulses would lead to further struggles. The same centralized authority that William built would later provoke baronial revolts and demands for reform, culminating in the development of common law and the beginnings of parliamentary government. In this way, the conquest's legacy was not only domination but transformation. It set in motion forces that would eventually shape English liberty itself. The transformation of language, law, and society did not erase the trauma of conquest. For generations, chroniclers wrote of the suffering and upheaval that followed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, continued for a short time after Hastings, spoke of the burning and plundering that left the land desolate. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of destruction, especially in the north. Yet amid the ruin, a new England emerged, one more connected to Europe, more organized under central authority, and increasingly distinct in identity. The blending of Norman and English traditions created something stronger than either alone. Out of the ashes of defeat grew a nation that would one day define itself through its endurance and adaptability. Still, it is impossible to understand that later strength without acknowledging the cost. The human suffering that followed Hastings was immense. Tens of thousands died in battle, famine, or repression. Whole communities were uprooted. The cultural memory of that loss endured in subtle ways. Even centuries later, English writers would look back on the conquest as both a tragedy and a turning point. It became a story of loss transformed into resilience, of defeat turned into rebirth. The memory of Harold's fall, the image of the arrow, and the burning of the north all became part of a shared narrative of endurance. This capacity to turn suffering into story, to reshape trauma into identity, is one of the most enduring legacies of the conquest. The centuries after William's victory saw the slow merging of conqueror and conquered into a single people. The descendants of Norman lords intermarried with English families, their French gradually giving way to English. By the time of later kings, the ruling class no longer thought of itself as foreign. Yet the traces of its origin remained in the language of law, in the architecture of castles, and in the structure of power. The English monarchy that expanded across the centuries bore the imprint of both its Saxon roots and its Norman inheritance. Even the conflicts that followed, the struggles between crown and nobles, the wars with France, the tensions between local identity and royal authority, all grew from the soil tilled by the conquest. In a deeper sense, the conquest defined how England would understand itself forever after. The idea of being both insular and outward-looking, of being shaped by foreign influence yet fiercely independent, began here. The Norman rulers imposed their culture on England, but in doing so they also became English. The island's identity became one of absorption and adaptation, taking what was foreign and making it its own. The very language that grew from this mix would become a global force, spreading far beyond the island's shores in centuries to come. The irony of 1066 is that the most successful invasion in English history eventually produced one of the most enduring and self-confident national identities in the world. Yet this long arc of transformation does not erase the reality of the shattered England that emerged in the immediate aftermath. For those who lived through the first years after Hastings, the future offered little comfort. They saw burned villages, lost family, and new masters speaking an alien tongue. They lived through a time when the old world had collapsed, and the new one had yet to take shape. The suffering of those years is easy to forget when viewed from the distance of history, but it was the crucible in which modern England was formed. Every rebellion, every act of defiance, every word that survived from the old tongue contributed to the creation of a shared resilience that became part of the national character. In that sense, the legacy of Hastings was paradoxical. It was both destruction and creation, both loss and renewal. The Norman victory broke England's old order, but laid the foundation for a new one that would endure and evolve. The immediate devastation gave rise to lasting institutions, the central monarchy, the rule of law, and a culture capable of absorbing change. The language that emerged from the mixing of conqueror and conquered became the medium through which England would later express its literature, its law, and its spirit. The pain of conquest became the seed of identity. The story of the aftermath, then, is not only about the end of Anglo-Saxon England, but about the beginning of something larger. The rebellion and ruin, the foreign rule, and the long process of adaptation all combined to forge a people more complex and resilient than before. The scars of 1066 never fully faded, but they became part of the landscape of English history, a reminder that identity is not born from purity, but from struggle and survival. From the ashes of a shattered kingdom rose a new England, one that would carry forward the memory of its defeat and transform it into strength, shaping the destiny of the island for centuries to come. The shadow of the Norman Conquest still stretches across modern Britain, even though almost 1,000 years have passed since that October day when the armies of Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy met on the field near Hastings. What began as a brutal battle for a crown became a transformation of language, power, and culture that still defines the English identity. Every generation that looks back on 1066 finds something new in it, a mirror reflecting its own concerns and assumptions. The conquest is not a static event buried in the past. It is a living part of the way Britain understands itself. To this day, its traces can be found in the words people speak, the institutions they trust, and the stories they tell about who they are. To understand why 1066 still echoes in the modern world is to recognize how history is never truly over. It continues to shape the present in quiet but profound ways. One of the most direct legacies of the Norman Conquest lies in the English language itself. The merging of Anglo-Saxon speech with Norman French produced a linguistic blend that has never stopped evolving. Nearly every sentence of modern English carries within it a memory of the conquest. Everyday words like house, bread, and field come from the Old English tongue, while words of government and sophistication, court, justice, council, and authority, are Norman in origin. This dual vocabulary reflects a historical division between rulers and ruled, between those who governed and those who labored. For centuries after the conquest, English was the language of commoners, French the language of the elite, and Latin the language of law and learning. Over time, these worlds merged, creating a flexible and expressive tongue capable of bridging social and cultural divides. When modern English speakers shift easily between simple and complex terms, between plain and formal expression, they are unconsciously drawing on that ancient fusion of conqueror and conquered. The linguistic consequences of 1066 go far beyond vocabulary. They shape the rhythms, tone, and spirit of English thought. The mixing of languages fostered a habit of adaptability, a readiness to borrow and reshape. That trait became central to the identity of English culture. The willingness to take in what is foreign and make it one's own can be traced directly to the centuries that followed the Norman Conquest. Even the English sense of humor, with its irony and understatement, carries hints of this layered past, an awareness of overlapping perspectives, of speech that can carry more than one meaning. The English language, like the nation itself, was built on contradiction and compromise. It absorbed difference not by erasing it, but by folding it into its structure. The fact that English would later become a global language owes much to this early experience of fusion and resilience. Beyond language, the institutional legacy of the conquest continues to shape British life. The The centralized monarchy that emerged under William and his successors laid the groundwork for many of the structures that define the modern state. Before 1066, kings ruled through loose alliances with local nobles, and authority was scattered across the land. The Normans replaced that system with one rooted in feudal obligation and royal supremacy. Land was granted by the crown in return for service, creating a direct bond between ruler and subject. Over the centuries, as feudalism gave way to more modern forms of governance, that bond evolved into a relationship between state and citizen. The principle that the law flows from the crown, and that the crown is responsible for justice and order, still underpins the British constitutional system. The monarchy's symbolic authority, the structure of the courts, and even the language of parliament all bear marks of Norman influence. The legal system, too, carries the imprint of the conquest. The Normans introduced written record-keeping, codified law, and centralized administration. The Domesday Survey was not just a tool of taxation, but an assertion of control and accountability. It represented a new idea of government as something that could measure and record the lives of its subjects. From that impulse grew the English common law, a body of precedent and procedure that balanced royal authority with practical judgment. The emphasis on evidence, precedent, and reasoned argument, hallmarks of modern British justice, has roots in this period of transition. The Norman approach to governance was meticulous and bureaucratic, while the Anglo-Saxon tradition valued custom and community. Their fusion produced a legal culture that prized both order and fairness. When people today speak of the rule of law as a cornerstone of British life, they are echoing a principle forged in the aftermath of Hastings. Architecture and landscape still carry visible reminders of that transformation. Castles, once symbols of oppression, now dot the countryside as romantic ruins or national monuments. Their presence in nearly every region speaks to the thoroughness of Norman control. Each fortress was a statement of power, built to watch, intimidate, and defend. Over time, many of these strongholds became centers of local government or royal administration. The great cathedrals that followed, Durham, Winchester, Canterbury, and others, embodied not only religious devotion but also the artistic and engineering ambition that came with Norman rule. These structures defined the skyline of medieval England and established a legacy of public architecture that carried forward into later eras. Even the notion of the state as a visible, monumental presence has roots in the Norman blending of faith, power, and design. The legacy of the conquest is not only institutional but psychological. It established a deep awareness of the vulnerability of the island, the sense that peace and identity could be overturned by invasion. That anxiety, born of real conquest, shaped how later generations imagined England's place in the world. The determination to guard its shores, to control its narrative, and to define what it meant to be English all stem from that foundational trauma. The defeat of Harold and the subjugation that followed were not easily forgotten. Over time, the memory of invasion turned into a lesson about resilience. England, having been conquered once, vowed never to be conquered again. This sentiment colored national identity, influencing everything from military policy to cultural pride. The island's later obsession with its independence, from the wars with France to its modern political choices, owes something to the collective memory of 1066. Yet, the meaning of 1066 has never been fixed. Each era has reshaped the story to fit its own view of history. In the centuries following the conquest, chroniclers writing under Norman patronage celebrated William's victory as a divinely sanctioned event, proof of rightful rule and divine favor. English writers, meanwhile, preserved tales of loss and betrayal, portraying Harold as a tragic hero and the Normans as foreign usurpers. By the late Middle Ages, the lines between conqueror and conquered had blurred, and the story of Hastings became a shared national origin, a reminder of both suffering and survival. The Tudors, seeking to legitimize their own claims to the throne, embraced the Norman legacy as part of a continuous English monarchy. In the Victorian era, when empire and nationalism defined Britain's self-image, the conquest was retold as the birth of a strong, unified state, a necessary step in the island's rise to greatness. Each retelling reflected the needs and ambitions of the time. In the modern age, 1066 has become both a symbol of change and a subject of irony. Schoolchildren learn the date as one of the few everyone remembers, but few reflect on what it truly represents. The battle has been reduced to a simple image: a king struck by an arrow, a Norman duke raising his banner in triumph. The simplicity of that story hides the complexity of the event and its consequences. The conquest was not a single moment of victory, but a process of transformation, resistance, and adaptation that lasted for decades. Yet the power of the date endures precisely because it condenses that long, painful history into one memorable moment. It gives people a way to grasp the beginning of everything that followed. In that sense, the myth of 1066 is not false. It is a shorthand for truths too large to hold in full detail. This process of simplification, of turning history into symbol, reveals how collective memory works. Every culture selects certain moments to stand for larger truths. These moments become anchors in the story a people tell about themselves. The date of Hastings serves as such an anchor. It represents change, conquest, and renewal all at once. Its endurance in memory speaks to its usefulness, not its accuracy. The challenge for anyone studying history is to look beyond the shorthand, to see what has been lost in the compression. The story of 1066 is not only about kings and battles. It is about language, law, and identity. It is about ordinary people caught in the tides of history. To understand it fully is to see how myth and fact intertwine, how the stories we tell about the past shape the world we live in. In modern Britain, echoes of the conquest can be heard in debates about identity, belonging, and heritage. The idea of being both native and mixed, of having a culture built from multiple strands, is central to British life today. The Norman Conquest reminds us that Englishness was never pure or static. It was always the product of encounter and adaptation. The island's history of invasion, migration, and integration runs deep. When people today argue about what it means to be British or who belongs, they are unknowingly continuing a conversation that began nearly 1,000 years ago. The blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon, once a source of division, became the foundation of a broader, more flexible identity. That same capacity for blending is what allowed Britain to build an empire and later, to absorb influences from across the world. The Norman legacy lives not in any one institution or monument, but in the cultural habit of turning different. At the same time, the story of 1066 reminds us to question the histories we take for granted. The image of the arrow in Harold's eye, so vivid and familiar, may not even be true. It is a product of interpretation, perhaps even propaganda, passed down through artistic representation like the Bayeux tapestry. That famous embroidery, itself a piece of Norman storytelling, presents the conquest as a rightful and orderly transition, downplaying its brutality. It was designed to legitimize William's rule, not to record an unbiased truth. Yet it became one of the most recognizable artifacts of English history, shaping the collective imagination for centuries. This pattern repeats across history. What survives is not always what was true, but what was useful. The myths we inherit often say more about the storytellers than about the events themselves. To challenge these myths is not to dismiss them, but to understand their power. When people remember 1066, they are engaging in a shared act of identity-making. The date becomes a way of connecting to the past, even when the details are forgotten or simplified. The same process shapes how we remember other iconic moments. The signing of the Magna Carta, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Battle of Waterloo. Each event becomes a milestone, a symbol of who we are. Yet, as history teaches, the truth beneath the symbols is always more complicated. The conquest of England was both an ending and a beginning, a story of violence that gave rise to renewal. Recognizing that complexity does not weaken national pride, it enriches it. It replaces myth with understanding, nostalgia with insight. The continuing fascination with 1066 also speaks to a broader human impulse. People look to history for meaning, for patterns that explain the present. The Norman Conquest offers a clear narrative of disruption followed by adaptation, of invasion turned into integration. It satisfies the desire to believe that from chaos can come order, from loss can come growth. This is why the date endures not only as a schoolroom fact, but as a metaphor. It represents the ability of a people to rebuild after defeat, to transform foreign rule into national strength. In that sense, 1066 is less a story about a battle than about the human capacity for endurance. Looking at modern Britain, the echoes of the conquest are everywhere, if often unnoticed. The monarchy, the legal system, the language, the architecture, and even the social hierarchy carry traces of that ancient upheaval. The English tendency to balance continuity with change, to evolve without losing tradition, stems from centuries of living with the legacy of that first great disruption. The blend of Norman order and Anglo-Saxon stubbornness produced a culture that values both authority and fairness, both structure and individual liberty. The institutions that emerged from this blend proved remarkably adaptable, surviving revolutions, reform, and modernization without losing their core identity. The endurance of the monarchy itself, redefined countless times yet still central to national life, mirrors the endurance of the story of Hastings. To understand why 1066 still matters is to see how the past continues to live within the present. The Norman Conquest was not merely a medieval power struggle. It was the beginning of a process that made Britain what it is. Every time someone uses a word of French origin without thinking, every time the Crown opens Parliament, every time a historian debates the meaning of Englishness, the shadow of that year falls across the moment. The conquest taught the island that identity is not fixed, that power and culture are always in motion. It showed that even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength. In the end, the date's endurance may lie not in its historical accuracy, but in its symbolic truth. 1066 stands for the moment when England changed forever, when its old world was broken and a new one began to form. It is a reminder that history is not a set of facts carved in stone, but a living conversation between past and present. Each generation finds in it what it needs, lessons of caution, resilience, or renewal. To revisit 1066 today is to question the stories we accept too easily, to look beyond the simplified images, and to see the complex, human reality beneath them. The conquest's greatest legacy may be this very challenge, to think critically about how history is made, remembered, and used. Every society has its foundational myths, the stories that give shape to its identity. 1066 is one of Britain's. Its power endures not because it tells a simple truth, but because it reminds us that truth itself is never simple. The Norman Conquest was both brutal and creative, destructive and transformative. It left behind a country torn apart, and yet capable of renewal. It gave rise to institutions that still function, a language that still evolves, and a people who continue to redefine themselves. To remember 1066 is to remember that history is both wound and healing, loss and invention. It echoes today not only in the monuments and the words, but in the very way the nation understands change itself. The story of Hastings, in all its pain and complexity, continues to speak because it tells a truth that never grows old, that identity is born from struggle, and that from the ashes of conquest, a people can learn to rise again.